Okay, welcome back to the fourth of our screencasts revision for the first part of the MN204 course. So now I'm just going to talk briefly about ethical issues. So, it's very important that you understand what ethics are as the principles of right and wrong that individuals use to make choices that guide their behavior. Very important to realize that ethics are very subjective. They're generally quite determined by the culture, religious traditions, legal traditions of the country that person is from. So what might be considered ethical in one context isn't necessarily ethical in another. So we talked about different ethical different bases for ethics. So there's about 5 of them we talked about. So what I would expect somebody to be able to do would be to consider a specific ethical decision in the light of the 5 different ones and be able to evaluate them in one and identify how a decision might be ethical according to one framework but unethical according to another, and to be able to reflect on the implications that has for management and for regulation. It's also important that you consider how to make a decision, with ethics in mind, so to recognize the fact that there's an ethical decision to be made, to gather the information, to make a decision and to review it. So to be familiar with that. What's very important when answering questions again on this is to think in terms of how it actually affects IT, the design of IT. So we had the Volkswagen emission scandal, we've had other with the WikiLeaks one, all of which there's an ethical dimension that can be considered. So rather than actually thinking in terms of a straightforward decision as to whether you find a €20 note on the road and whether it's okay to pick it up or not, think about it a little bit more deeply about something that specifically impacts on information technology. So I talked about the steps to ethical decision making. So recognize the issue, get the facts, evaluate what the potential actions are, make a decision and test it, and act and reflect on the outcomes of your decision. So ideally you want to learn from the decision that you've made. So there's kind of 2 other areas that are somewhat relevant to ethics. The first is privacy. Another is the idea of fake news, which we'll get to in a little while. But it's really important to be aware of the implications of information technology for your privacy. So the fact that you're carrying around a device that has a camera and a microphone on it at all times that's tracking your location has implications. And people may want to have some level of information privacy. So in other words, the right to determine when and to what extent information about you can be gathered and communicated to others. So in recent times, there's been a huge effort to improve and allow people to take control of their privacy in information technology through the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulations of the European Union. Whether they've been effective is very debatable. So, you have to think about the implications of GDPR for businesses, but also for individuals. Think about the consequences of your own privacy being compromised. So, flowing from the idea of ethics, an arising problem at the moment, and not one that's really covered that effectively maybe in the textbook. So we it's important to look at the lecture notes for this, is the idea of fake news. So we distinguish between different types of information that's incorrect on the internet. So there can be misinformation that's accidental, so we can have disinformation that's deliberate, where people actually tell a lie. And then the idea of fake news is fabricated information that mimics news media content in form, but not in organizational process or intent. So be able to distinguish between those types of information, understand that this has consequences to this. So Pizzagate was a slur against Hillary Clinton. Brexit bananas was a false news story planted in the UK media to attempt to discredit the European Union. A hack on the Associated Press Twitter account resulted in the Dow Jones being driven down. And I think you might maybe remember from this year, Momo Panic where a lot of this was people spreading lies to try and scare other people. Another serious consequence of it that's spread through social media is skepticism around the efficacy of vaccines. Okay, so also, related to privacy is the idea and to be aware of the fact that we're under surveillance at times. So technology is being used to monitor our behaviour to some degree in this country, to quite an extensive degree in some other countries. So it could be by employers, governments and other institutions. So you think of all the cameras and different things that are tracking you as you go around the place. So if you think of the employer how doing it, it's very important that there's policies in place that you're aware of. So understand what the effective policies are and what the implications of those policies not being followed are. Another thing that ties into this is the idea of the acceptable use policy. So it's very important that you won't, when you agree to an acceptable use policy, that you don't violate law, you don't compromise the security of an organization, you don't spam it with commercial messages, that you will actually acknowledge when you've made a mistake, that you will repudiate any errors that you've made, so that if you've posted something false, you'll correct it or take it down. You won't spam it. You won't try and crash it by sending mail bombs. It's important to realize that there are very serious consequences for people who violate the IT policies in their work. So if you're working, make sure you read your IT policy, because if you breach it, it could cost you your job. Okay, so in the next section we're going to talk about security.